الله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله لا نفرق بين أحد من رسله وقالوا سمعنا وأطعنا غفرانك ربنا وإليك المصير. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. To God belongs whatever is in the heavens and whatever is in the earth. Whether you disclose what is in your hearts or hide it, God will bring you to account for it. Then He will forgive whomever He wishes and punish whomever He wishes, and God has power over all things. The Prophet has faith in what has been sent down to him from his Lord, and all the faithful. Each of them has faith in God, His angels, His scriptures, and His prophets. They declare, we make no distinction between any of His prophets. And they say, we hear and obey. Our Lord, forgive us, and toward you is the return.
Thank you, Muhammad, for that recitation and for starting our program off. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. There's a verse in the Quran. It says, O you who have faith, fasting is prescribed for you as it was for those before you, so that perhaps you will attain piety. So, as many of you know, we are in the Islamic month of Ramadan, which is the 9th lunar month, and this is the month in which Muslims fast. So all of us here are mostly fasting, and we are very honored that we will be able to break our fast with all of you guests, honored guests, friends, neighbors as well. So that will happen at the end of our program. First, just so everyone's aware of our agenda, one of the reasons I also recited this verse is that fasting is not something that is specific to Islam. As mentioned in this verse of the Quran, this was a tradition that God had revealed to many other peoples, and it is found in many other scriptures, and it is a practice that others, those of other faiths, also partake in various forms. And in the past, for those, maybe some of you who have been here a few times, we've done this event in a few different ways, but this year we wanted to, in the spirit of the Lent season and also the season of Ramadan, to have this interfaith event where we get perspectives from both our Muslim perspective and also our Christian perspective, and we have invited scholars to do that. And then we will have a short question and answer where we can learn from each other. But the topic is spiritual growth through sacrifice. And so sacrifice is something that, maybe it's a 4-letter word nowadays, nobody wants to wait and sacrifice anything. We live in the, in Arabic actually, it's in Quran, it's called kun fayakun, which basically means be and it is. This is something that God does, but now we have Amazon and it's like be and it's there in 24 hours. So we're almost there to God. But so we're not necessarily in the times of sacrificing, but we have these periods in our faith traditions that allow us to remember that and to bring that back. So we are honored to have our first guest speaker, Reverend Dr. Michael Wolf, who is the Senior Minister of Lake Street Church of Evanston and the Co-Associate Regional Minister of the American Baptist Churches of Metro Chicago. He holds a Doctor of Theology degree from Harvard Divinity School and teaches theology at Lewis University. He is the co-author of Anti-Islamophobic Church, and that will be out with Judson Press in 2026, so you can pre-order if you'd like. Maybe not with Amazon though. And the co-founder of the Challenging Islamophobia Together Chicagoland, both with his spouse, Reverend Dr. Anna Piela as well. So I will ask him to come up and we can welcome him with a round of applause. You can just click this.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Okay, well, lovely. So on Christmas Eve, I often joke that I have the really unenviable position of standing between people and Christmas dinner, and however long I talk, I'm going to keep them from it. And this is slightly different, which is great because we know when the food is going to come, and that we have a timetable, and that just feels so much better. And I think that we're all going to stay on track. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really thankful for the opportunity to make new friends, to continue the work that we're doing between weaving communities together and figuring out how we can be in solidarity with one another and learn from one another. And I'm just really grateful to be here. I'm so grateful for the hospitality shown to me and to all the other guests here. It really is inspiring. So I want to start with Abraham, which might even seem a little cliche, but I think it's really important. Abraham, in many ways, is the progenitor of faith. This idea of monotheism that we get, these ideas that we have, they all originate with Abraham. And when we see the story about Abraham, and when we read that, we understand and are introduced to the idea of sacrifice relatively early. Many folks are going to know that story where Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son. This sort of story where we are introduced to the fact that God is going to ask for sacrifices. And one of the things that we don't pause to do is to ask, why does Abraham say, okay, that sounds like a rational thing to do? Abraham was in a context where sacrifice of children, sacrifice of something so dear made sense. And so he is asked to do a sort of rational thing. Amongst all the peoples, amongst all this story, he could find a way to say, okay, I guess this makes sense. And all in that same story, of course, we're told God says, well, I didn't really quite mean that, and we're going to stay that, and we're going to offer some other ways of sacrifice. But in that story, what's revealed is that God is a fan of sacrifice in some way, but not the kind of sacrifice that's going to tear families, that's going to rend a real fabric of a community apart. But God is going to demand a sacrifice. So what is that sacrifice going to look like? That sacrifice is going to have to come from within us. There's going to be things that we can offer upon an altar or not offer upon an altar. We can give or we can withhold from ourselves. This is the sacrifice that delights God that we are trying to figure out and trying to understand. And so we're in this time of sacrifice. We're in Ramadan, and of course it's a time of sacrifice. Some people in here are sacrificing a lot. They're fasting. Other people are not sacrificing as much. We're here to learn. Of course, we're in the season of Lent as well, which is a wonderful time of confluence where fasting is a sort of typical thing that happens in Christian communities. So we have these beautiful moments of fasting that sacrifice. Why do it? Why sacrifice? What is promised? Well, it seems like what we are offered on these spiritual paths, regardless of religion, is if we are willing to sacrifice, then the possibility of growth, of something more than we are now, can take place. And Lent begins with this model in the Christian tradition of how we ought to think about our lives, and it's this story. And in it, Jesus, or Isa if you prefer, goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the end of that time, he is tempted. It is one of probably the most iconic points in the Christian imagination, this scene. Jesus is taken to great heights, shown all the kingdoms of the world, and said that they can be Jesus's if only he will bow down and worship Satan. He is told that if he tests God's love, then he can have anything. And he is asked if he will use his powers to gratify himself, then he can have food and drink to eat after 40 days of fasting. That's a pretty good offer. I think that I would have been tempted by that. I'm of less stuff than that. I think I would have been tempted after 24 hours, but he's talking about 40 days and 40 nights. In Lent, Christians are sort of invited into this central story, this idea, as a time of fasting, of reflection, but really of discernment in order to ready themselves for the holy mysteries of Easter. And while Lent might be something that the whole Christian world is doing together, I want to draw your attention to how it's deeply personal. The reflection that takes place is about where you are invited to go. what you're invited to do with this one life that you have to live. What sacrifices are you called to make? And that is deeply personal. Where are we going to put our efforts? The sacrifices that are demanded in order to reach those collaborative goals with God are personal. They are deeply individual. And yet, the temptations are timeless. They are personal, of course, to what Jesus was going through at that time. 40 days and 40 nights without food and water is probably going to make you open to a lot of temptations. If you look at them, they're temptations that we all face. They are in some ways relate back to our human condition. The fact that we have egos, the fact that we have needs in our bodies and our spirits. We need things, our bodily and spiritual needs. We need to eat. We need to feed our bodies. And yet, to feed our bodies in the wrong time or in the wrong place is not good. When we feed ourselves at the expense of others, when we have plenty to eat and there are those who have nothing to eat, it ought to at least make us pause to consider if that is the time or the place. That is certainly the lesson I think that Ramadan teaches in some ways as well, about solidarity with those who have nothing to eat, about feeling this together, that we are in a web of being together. Surely, when we look at these temptations, we can say, Jesus would have probably been a better ruler than any Caesar known to humankind. But that was not Jesus' purpose. So when we look at that temptation, we know that so many things are good, so many things are honorable, so many things are just, but they are not ours to do. We cannot pursue them all. And some good things can wind up being distractions from the good that God has called us to do, here and now. And I think that that is the lesson of Lent, of any really spiritual reflection, is to figure out what God wants you to do now with your life, with this one thing that you've been blessed with that you can determine the course of, your one life. That's the lesson of Lent, that we have good to do, the only we can do it, and we must find out what that good is. And of course, to find out what that good is requires sacrifice. It is a sacrifice, I think, to know that we are called to do some good and to set aside still other good to pursue the good thing we're called to. It is sacrifice not to place our needs first, and it is sacrifice to humble ourselves so that we might do the good that may never be seen, talked about, or appreciated, or even apprehended by human audiences. Scripture tells us that if what we do excites other people and they clap for it and they think it's awesome and great, then we already have our reward. Why would you need anything else? And so, when we already have our reward, we ought to be covetous, not of people's praise, but of God's praise. That is what we ought to be seeking. And of course, this requires a fundamental rewiring of our brains. Jawad was talking a little bit about Amazon, how it's instant gratification. I'm asking you, and I think Lent asks you, and I think Ramadan, any spiritual discipline asks you, to get away from short-term reward and think towards the long-term, the longest-term reward. And that is the really long-term reward that our Creator has made us for. You see, you were created for and yearn for a reality that we do not ever experience or apprehend or see directly in this lifetime. And I think this is probably the whole basis of spirituality, going all the way back. That we are more than our corporeal bodies, we are more than mere flesh, but we are a spirit that was made for union with God. And so we're going to hear in a little bit some examples of prophets who sacrificed and who gave us a model of a way to live, how we might think about that spiritual discipline. And very few of them, if you were to trace them, were praised in this life. Very few of them walked around and everyone just clapped constantly. If you look at these stories in the Quran, or if you look at these stories in the Bible, if you look at these stories anywhere, you will find people who are generally disliked, hated. They bring what we might call division everywhere they go. And yet, there are times when we read stories about them and we see what great spiritual rock stars they really were. When we apprehend this central fact, we begin to see the world as God sees it. And I really do believe that this changes everything. It is, of course, a sacrifice to come into a place and to begin to see things as God sees it, and not how we see it, not how our brains are wired for short-term, instant gratification. But I think that this sacrifice is one that all the great religions of the world have said time and time again is absolutely worth it. Because if we can sacrifice this specific thing, to believe without seeing, to do without fully apprehending, then we can be invited into that world that our Creator made for us. We can be invited to touch it, that house not made with human hands, eternal in the heavens and in our hearts. We are in fact invited to walk right into that house. And the same is true, I think, if we refuse sacrifice. If we do that, then we can never walk into that house and that world that God has created for us, which is deeper and more pleasant, and further on it goes, the better and better it gets. We can never see that God has created each being on this earth for life abundant, that they might have enough. We can never see that when we give charity or zakat, that we are linking ourselves inexorably in a great chain of being, that we are not so disconnected from each other as we once thought. That invisible architecture that binds us all together will remain invisible unless we can first accept this fundamental rewiring of our world, of our hearts, this sacrifice to give up this sort of short-term reward. Because God has given us free will, God is not going to come down and make us all apprehend instantly everything. God is not going to say, well, you really should sacrifice in the short term for the following reasons. God doesn't generally appear and talk to us like that. God doesn't force us to make good decisions for ourselves. God instead invites us into the spiritual life, into a rich and deep relationship so that we might know God better and deeper and better and more truly. And that means that when we see and when we have suffering and sacrifice and we see inequality and we see this world so differently and we begin to see everything differently, we can begin to apprehend the sort of existence that God has created for us and intended for us from time immemorial. And that existence, of course, is linked to other believers. I dare say that it links us in this room together right now, this invisible architecture that I'm talking about. If we might sacrifice our sense of separation from one another, if we can simply see beyond the things that keep us apart from one another, that separate us, then we might also gain a sense of solidarity and camaraderie with one another, that we are about God's business here on earth. And I do believe it is the same business. Perhaps God has given us, each individuals and as communities, different things to do, but God's will remains the same: to feed the hungry, to pursue that invisible architecture that I'm talking about, to do good that is set before us, to do the good that is ours in our appointed time to do. It does not differ across language or tradition. God's will remains the same. And we cannot afford to have God's will remain invisible. We must work tirelessly to make that invisible architecture that binds us all together, the very stuff of creation, visible. We must work tirelessly in our personal lives to make it come into reality. And I believe that events like this one really do make that possible, where we see and we apprehend differences and come together, and we are able to say that there is still a God who created this, who created us, and who is inviting us still further and deeper in, that make that reality more apparent, that make it more visible to our eyes, so that we can see we have so much good to do together. So much good. Really and truly, there is joy in learning with and from one another so that we can begin and continue the great journey that we have been on as people of faith, to figure out just exactly what we're called to make the sacrifices necessary to attain spiritual growth and to pursue truth together. And if we can do that, I really do think that we can make that invisible architecture visible. We can see with the eyes that God sees, and we can begin to do remarkable things together. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Reverend Wolf. That was a beautiful speech, inspiring words. The one thing I did take from it, I didn't clap for you though. I wanted you to get the reward from God. So I let everyone else clap for you. See, I was paying attention. Yes, those were excellent words, and I think that encapsulated a lot of the purpose of this gathering, and one of the reasons we wanted to hold the event in this way. I think Reverend Wolf's tying it together with the invisible architecture metaphor was incredible in the sense that upstairs I was talking about the architecture that we see everywhere, but the invisible architecture is far more important because that's what binds us. That's what helps us to connect, and then through those connections make meaningful, bring meaning to our lives, and then do good works and try to improve ourselves and then the society around us. So thank you very much for your words of inspiration. And one more time, maybe a round. This time I'll join in on the round of applause. Our next speaker is Sheikh Reza Himyari. Sheikh Reza was born in Iran, but moved with his family to the United States, to the Northern Virginia area where he grew up when he was a young child. He began his seminary studies in the holy city of Najaf, Iraq, and continued at the Ahlul Bayt Islamic Seminary here in Streamwood. That was actually the seminary that we had as a part of our mosque for many years, and he was one of our graduating students who is going on to do many great things. He is currently pursuing further seminary studies in Iran. And just for those who aren't familiar, in the Shia tradition, there's two major seminaries in the world. One is in Najaf, which he studied at for a while, and one is in Qom, where he's studying now. So these are kind of like, these are our Harvards in the Islamic seminary, the Shia Islamic seminary. But he's also completing his PhD here in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago, which I think is just a thesis away at this point. So we're looking forward to seeing that. But now I would like to invite him up. Please welcome him. Thank you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله الطاهرين. Dear guests, Reverend and brothers and sisters, we say in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, which means peace be upon you, welcome, and thank you all for joining us. It is a very special month, a very sacred month for Muslims all across the world, and to be able to break bread with all of you on this day. We are coming up against the end of the month, which is also a very special time. As was mentioned, sacrifice is really important, but also knowing when to stop sacrificing is also very important. So there's celebrations, there's giving, and there's receiving that every Muslim looks forward to. I want to first start out by thanking the Reverend for sharing your wisdom and your insight on the importance and the meaning of sacrifice in allowing us to apprehend that sacred architecture that you mentioned. And that's really what I would like to as well focus on tonight, but rather I'd like to focus on the second half, which is gaining strength through sacrifice. Right? So what is that apprehension? apprehension part? What is that seeing or that discovery? And usually when we talk about interfaith and interfaith conversations that we have, a lot of times we will think about sort of our traditions and the principles upon which our traditions are based. So each one of us comes from a very particular tradition, a particular religious tradition, and have our own sacred texts that we read, we reflect on, and that we try to share with others and maybe even study. Now, many times when we engage in these sort of interfaith discussions, we also try to, for example, talk about shared values and maybe even shared virtues that we are all trying to achieve in our own lives. And this is also one way that the Quran talks about religion in general and the place of Islam in the family of the Abrahamic religions. And that is, of course, Islam's relationship to Judaism and to Christianity and the other religions that were a part of the context of the Prophet of Islam. So the Quran presents the Prophet's role as calling his audience, the people that he was preaching to the initial story of humankind. And a story that was filled with revelation, in which Adam, the first prophet, the first human being that God created, was raised by God and was taught by God. And of course, it is that same Adam which is our collective father and progenitor. And it is this through line of revelation and guidance by God that the Quran highlights, connects Adam and all of the different religious traditions all the way to the Prophet that now is revealing or is bringing the Quran. And it says, I will recite, because the tradition that we are familiar with usually is in the Arabic, so I will just try to confine, just recite a few of the words in Arabic, and then I will provide the translation. So the Quran says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَالَّذِينَ هَادُوا وَالنَّصَارَى وَالصَّابِئِينَ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا فَلَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. Now you all might be wondering what that means, so I will provide the translation. Indeed, the faithful, the Jews, the Christians, and the Sabians, another religious tradition, in the context in which the Prophet came to his people, he says, this is a very important point that connects all of the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet. Those of these different religious traditions who have faith in God and the last day and act righteously, they shall have their reward from their Lord, and they will have no fear, nor will they grieve and be saddened. In other words, these are the three ingredients that Islam, the three main principles, the bedrock upon which the Islamic tradition is based. And Islam, the Prophet claims that all religious traditions ultimately share, and all of which are reflected in the depths of the human soul. In this process of discovery of ourselves and that sacred architecture that the Reverend mentioned. They are having faith in God, believing that we as human beings are moral creatures, and that we will be held responsible for our actions, and that compels us, that pushes us to do righteous deeds. And this is what every religious tradition, every divine revelation is ultimately about. It is this being, this belief, and this action that determines how we face God when He judges us for the lives that we live. Now, this makes our lives, our relationship with Islam and with other religious traditions kind of simple. So if you adhere to these three principles, then you are in the good graces of God. But it also makes it a little bit difficult because, in other words, Muslims don't believe that there is any special guarantee that God has given them, that I will have and enjoy that joy and that reward if I do not abide by these principles. There is no other chosen community that can reject these principles, this bedrock, and be still in the good graces of God and for God not to hold that person accountable. And so, even the believing individuals, those faithful, in the Quran it says, those who have faith and do not taint their faith with wrongdoing, they are the ones who are rightly guided. So, there's this two sides to the coin, but these are in terms of, again, the principles that we usually talk about when we talk in terms of interfaith conversations. Now, I'd like to just mention another approach to our interfaith conversations that maybe can be also and equally illuminating. To take those principles, to live our lives rooted in our traditions, but now to turn our focus on those stories. The Reverend mentioned the story of Jesus, of Nabi Isa as we call him and as we know him, but to think about that strength through the sacrifice in the stories of the people that we revere. Because those individuals, not only do they show us the depths of their character, but they also broaden our own horizons for who we could possibly be and the heights we can attain as human beings, as creatures, and as parts of God's creation. And so, we look at the stories of the prophets. And in fact, this is another one of those through lines that the Quran repeats and mentions throughout the text. So it says, we have faith in God and what has been sent down to us. And what was sent down to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and that which Moses and Jesus were given, and that which the prophets were given from their Lord, we make no distinction between any of them, and to Him do we submit. And the Quran tells us that, in fact, it is the stories and the memories of these individuals that the people of the time in which the Quran was revealed, this is what each one of them was laying claim to, and that ultimately God lays claim to Himself. So it is these individuals, the heights of moral character, the heights of what it means to be virtuous, what it means to sacrifice, and also what it means to have strength. And so in particular with Abraham, it is said, the Quran tells us that some people in the Arabian Peninsula where the Prophet came, some said that he was a Jew and that he was part of our community. Others said that he was a Christian. The Quran says that the only people who can lay claim to Abraham are those who lived the life of Abraham, who stood up for the principles of Abraham. And those are the ones who are nearest to Abraham, not an individual who is a part of a single community or a single tribe, but rather the tribe of Abraham is defined by his principles. Indeed, the nearest of all people to Abraham are those who follow him, and this prophet who is following the example of Abraham, and those who have faith, those who have that confidence and that conviction in God. And so we find this similar through line, this similar bedrock in all of the stories of the prophets, at least as the Quran has mentioned them, and that we all share. So when we, for example, break out into our own conversations at our own tables, hopefully we have people from another tradition at our table, maybe we can share, and if we don't, it's okay, we can move around. Hopefully we can share some of our memories, some of those stories, and our perspectives on those events during the Prophet's life. So for example, this beautiful story of Abraham. How do I see it? What are my reflections and what are yours? And now when we look in the stories of the prophets, we notice that all of their stories are stories of ultimately sacrifice, but there are stories also revealed to us. Islam, on one level, is a religion of discovery, the discovery of our own capacity as human beings, but also the very basis of the creation of God. How did God create this world, and what are the underlying structures of God's creation? In other words, they attained their strength, the prophets and the saints. They attained their strength despite all of the difficulties that they faced. The story of Abraham is particularly beautiful. It seems like God changes the laws of physics, the laws of nature, for the sake of Abraham and his sacrifice. We have this story in the Islamic tradition. I'm not entirely familiar with the Christian tradition, whether you have the same story, but if you do, then we will connect on that level. But basically, Abraham goes to the house in which the idols were collected, and Abraham destroys the idols, and the people turn around and they say, "What have you done?" And they create this huge fire, and Abraham is about to be thrown into the fire, and he is concerned. In some of our traditions, they tell us that angels themselves come and give Abraham safety. They say, "If Abraham, you ask us, we will give you safety." And Abraham turns and he says, "I only seek my safety from God." And when he is flung into the fire, it is said that God cools the fire for Abraham, and it does not touch him, nor does it burn him. In other words, God changes the laws of physics for Abraham. When he is about to sacrifice his son, because of his devotion to God, God blunts the blade, and he does not allow the neck of Ishmael to be, or Isaac, again, different traditions, to be cut. In other words, courage and sacrifice has the strength to change the laws of nature. When Moses is in the full comfort of the land of Egypt, he is living in luxury and in comfort, and yet he sacrifices that comfort to save the life of an Israelite, and then he is forced into exile and becomes a refugee, in fear and terror, going from one land to another. But after many years of even safety in his exile, he must once again sacrifice and go back to Egypt. But because of that sacrifice, what does God respond with? He responds with the voice that Abraham hears of God himself. And he does not give him weapons and arms to now go and stand up against the unjust ruler of his time, Pharaoh, who is now putting down the Israelites and being unjust to them. Rather, God gives him the conviction and the strength of faith. And so he gives him a staff, and he gives him his own hand, which he uses as his miracles in the face of God. And so here, God as well seems to be changing the laws of politics. Laws of nature, the laws of politics. You do not go up against the strongest military power of your time, which is Pharaoh in Egypt, with just a stick and your hand. At least I would not be able to do that. David changes the laws of war, goes up against an army and is victorious. The lifelong sacrifice of Mary, including her reputation as the pious and the most righteous lady in front of the Israelites, God even changes the laws of creation for the sacrifice of Mary. In the Quran, it's mentioned, as Jawad actually recited, says that when Jesus was given to Mary, God simply said, "Be," and he was. In other words, Jesus is also known as the Word, the Logos, in the Islamic tradition, and he is created with a simple word, "be." Now, I've been saying this entire time that God changes the laws of nature, of creation, of war and politics. But the Quran explains also that God doesn't actually change much of anything in his creation. There are laws and rules upon which God creates his world. Rather, what happens is that God only reveals to us that underlying structure that he has created his world upon. And so in one verse of the Quran, it speaks of the Prophet and his family, the Prophets of Islam, who say that they sacrifice purely for the sake of God. They give to the orphan, to the poor, and the prisoner only for his sake. And this is a very famous story that's mentioned in the Quran, where it is said that the cousin of the Prophet, a man by the name of Ali, he and his family, his two children, in one report says that they were sick and they were ill, and they vowed to fast for God, for the sake of God, so that their children can become well once again. And after a day of fasting, as you might imagine, it is a long day, it is maybe a hot day, a day where you want to break your fast with a cup of water. And it is said that at the end of the day, instead of running to the table and getting as much food in them as possible, they hear a knock on their door. And they see that it is a person in need. And so they give a third of their food that these two parents and their two young and ill children, they were supposed to eat for themselves. They give a third of their food to the orphan, to the needy. And then, once they're about to go back to the table, they hear another knock. And it's an orphan, and they give a second third. And then, right when they're going back, they hear a third knock, and it is a prisoner, and they give the rest of their food to the prisoner. So in other words, people at all different parts of society, all of those who are in need, they are willing to sacrifice what they want and what they need for the sake of these people. Now, in response, however, the Quran, it clarifies the basic principle. It says, those people who for the love of God, who for the sake of God, feed the needy, the orphan and the prisoner. They say, again, the heights of human possibility and human virtue. They say, we feed you only for the sake of God. We desire no reward from you, nor any thanks. Indeed, all we do is we fear the day in which God is going to hold us accountable. Even, in other words, the Prophet himself and his family, the people who are closest to him, and ostensibly the closest to God, they as well have to be concerned about how they will face their Lord. And the response comes that these are the very basic rules of God's creation. That if you give, if you sacrifice, then God will show you his own power. and His own capability and His own strength. And His strength will become your strength. So Allah will save them from the ills and the difficulties of that day, and He will bring joy to their hearts. I will end there. I have gone over my time. The good thing about being second is that you're closer to breaking the fast, but also you have to be more careful about your time. Thank you all very much, and yes, thank you all very much, and okay, I should stay here? All right.
So we still have, so just for the rest of the program, we have, I don't know what time it is right now, but let me see, 7:05. So basically, we have about 15 to 20 minutes for question and answers, and then we will have our congregation go upstairs for the prayer. But up until then, we can have questions and answers. I'll have a microphone that I can take along if anyone would like to ask questions. So, Reverend, I would ask you to come up to also field the questions. Anyone have any questions to start with that they would just feel free, raise your hand. Everyone's shy, so I'll start. Oh, we have one? Here we go.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, sir. I have one question for you, especially for Reverend. Do you believe that Jesus takes the sins away? Do you believe that?
I get, yeah, sure. I think that that's true. Yeah, I think that would be the answer of any sort of orthodox and believing Christian. That there is, it's called atonement, is how we think about that. We say that there is something. It's one of the only things that is not fully sort of theorized in the Christian tradition. There have been councils of many churches that have come to many conclusions, but there's only theories of atonement. But we say that there is something quite special about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that affects a change in one's relationship with God and one's eternal presence home.
Other questions? Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Back to sacrifice. Too often, at least in the minds of the common person, sacrifice is associated with killing someone or something and bloodshed. But we know that the English term sacrifice means to make sacred. Can you speak, both of you, what is sacred? How do you define sacred?
I think one of the things, I mean, you're both talking to two sort of scholars of religion a little bit, so one of the answers and one of the great answers that's been given, and one I actually think is quite good, is things set apart. Things set apart for a specific purpose and sort of ordained by God or in some way renders something sacred. That it's not, special. The special nature of things, I think, really does render it sacred. And that can be open to interpretation, right? So we can talk about that our houses of worship are sacred because they're set aside for the worship of God. But other things can be sacred too. I like to think that I hallow or make sacred many everyday things. How I eat, how I drink, how I spend my money. All of these things can be set aside for God.
That's excellent. And just as an additional point in the Islamic tradition, we don't necessarily have a direct translation for the word sacred. We do have something very close, so we call muqaddas or quddus, and so that means on one level it means to something that is praised, but also in some traditions say that's something that is ineffable. So the sacred is also something on one level, it is ineffable, indescribable, beyond our capacity to be able to rationalize, to be able to understand, or even be able to explain. Wow. So if I can't explain it, then that's
There's a lot of sacred things then if it's something I can't explain.
We're getting a lot of questions from our own community members. Is there anyone from outside of the Baitulilm community that would like to ask a question? Because we've already gotten a few. Well, he's part of our community. That's why I'm giving it to others first. You're also part of our community. You're also part of our... There's someone... here. Dave's got it. Thank
you. Is there something common to both faith traditions that maybe we each struggle with, but in our own way, that might make for a good interfaith discussion, like between two lay people?
Starts out.
I think there's quite a bit. I've personally benefited a lot from the literary tradition of the Christian tradition. So, for example, everything from Dante. And Dante's journey. That's just eye-opening in so many different ways, because ultimately our traditions were always in conversation with one another, even though they weren't always seeing eye to eye, right? And so we're pulling from each other's traditions. Islam grew up in a context in which it was faced with other traditions, so Christianity, Judaism, the Sabians, and so on and so forth. You can't really quite understand Islam in that period, in that time period, without knowing something about Christianity. And actually some historians, they will say that you can't really understand Christianity and Christian theology without having some idea about what the Quran says in terms of the context of Arabia and all of the different debates that were going on amongst Christians, amongst polytheists, amongst Jews, and so on. So each one of them gives a very good insight. Now for the layperson, that might not always translate, but for the layperson, one way that it presents itself is in terms of the stories, right? And those stories, of course, they're rooted in a particular tradition. So you can actually gain insight into, say, how we view Abraham versus, for example, how Abraham is presented in the Hebrew Bible. And that kind of opens up. But stories being stories, they're also entry points into your imagination, your creativity, and also your ability to extract meaning from those stories and apply them to your life, right? So I might come from a different tradition, but if I know where your stories are coming from, maybe God somehow opens my eyes and gives me insights into His creation through your stories. And that's a possibility, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer.
I would say something, that we all face is interpersonal relationships and something around forgiveness. I think there's a rich dialogue about different roles of forgiveness within both of our traditions and how we might pursue wholeness with one another and community. There's a lot of wisdom, I think, from both of our traditions and dialogue about that.
Oh, you have a question? Okay, one more, because we did two from one.
Oh, okay. In the Muslim religion, is there an afterlife, like a heaven and a hell?
Yes, it's quite we have quite detailed teachings about the afterlife. So from the time that someone is dying, illness, the final illness of a person, to death itself, to being buried, to the world after burial, which is before the afterlife. And then the final hour, which is when God brings all of creation to a close. He kind of rolls up the scroll of creation, or the rug of creation, whatever other image you want to use. And then he unfurls that rug or that scroll. And he brings everyone now in front of him as the final judge, and he judges people for their actions and their deeds, and he forgives, and he also doesn't forgive. So that's the long trajectory, but yeah, there's a very long, detailed teachings on that.
What a great image.
In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, my question is, as we study the life of Prophet Ibrahim, we find that he never had his food without a guest. Every time he will go in search of somebody, get them home and have food with the guest. This kind of a character of Prophet Ibrahim is not found being practiced in the religions which we call Abrahamic religions, the Christians, the Jews and the Muslims. That is to share the food with everybody who ever passed by the home, or go and search and get somebody to share the food. The question is, why don't we practice such a activity? Like, as I know that the Jews, the Sikh people from India, they have this practice of offering free food to one and all. So from the Muslims and Christians and the Jews, this behavior and the special character of Prophet Ibrahim was never to eat without having a guest. But we don't practice. Why?
Yes, I think the lack of that practice condemns us in some way. And I think many of the stories of the prophets and many of the stories that we encounter in our sacred literature are intended to move us to, who can say when they had a sick child, and the prophet Ali you were talking about, who can say that they would act in exactly the same way? In some ways they're supposed to critique us, to make us feel as if, if I could just move closer to that ideal. And I think that those stories should, and I think you're right, and certainly you're convicting us that should be true. Yeah. Well, I couldn't hear it.
And it's not a one-to-one thing where we can always apply exactly the teaching in our lives, because our lives are complicated, right? And we're making decisions on the go all the time. But it's a reflection. So just like a mirror, you look at yourself and you try to be the best that you can be for, not just for the mirror, but for other people. Those stories and those values of the prophets, they're supposed to be mirrors for us, right? So they are what we aspire to, but knowing that we're never going to reach it, right? They are the pinnacles of God's creation. And so we're constantly in this process of figuring out where we stand versus where they stood, how we can change our lives, and so on, considering our context and our individual circumstances. So yes, condemning ourselves, but then also, asking for forgiveness that we fall short.
Undoubtedly, though, the world would probably be a better place. That's for sure.
Other questions? Anyone from outside the community? We're trying to be fair. One? Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I just want to say something on sacrifice. The question was, what is sacrifice? In my humble opinion, it's unconditional love. So how you define that? When you are sacrificing, you have an unconditional love for one who is above all. So you are just giving. You're not expecting what would you get out of that. So it's your unconditional love that you're ready to sacrifice anything is needed because you are in love with the one who is above all. So I thought that is sacrifice.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay.
Let's talk about food again.
Okay.
Now, in Jewish tradition and Muslim tradition, I mean, they're kind of similar food, their food diet. And of course, food plays a very important role in any culture. Like, you must have heard about halal and kosher. They're probably similar, pretty similar. Now, when did, to my knowledge, early Christians were following like a kosher style of food. So when did it deviate? How long after Jesus Christ, after his resurrection, how long it took to deviate from the normal kosher diet that early Christians used to have?
Sure. Really quickly. So there's a story in the book of Acts in which one of the central figures, there was an apostle, has a giant sheet rolled out in front of them like a vision, in which all the different foods are coming up, and basically hears a voice from God, Jesus, sort of saying that all these foods are okay, and you can eat them all because it's not sort of what goes into a person that defiles them, but what comes out of their mouth that defiles them. And so it's this sort of idea that there are no restrictions. But this was part of a big battle that played out in early Christianity, where some people, of course, wanted to keep the kosher rules, and other people were advancing another way. And in general, Christianity, though, relatively early, sort of abandoned kosher rules. But it's in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, which is just stuff that happened after Jesus from all his friends talking.
So we are going to be going up. So I just wanted to ask one question, just so we can learn because the Islamic tradition in month of Ramadan is our fast is very structured. So it's like
right.
So I know that Lent is a little bit different. So how do maybe your denomination or others, how do they practice it? And just so maybe we can learn as well.
Okay. Yes. So this can run the whole gambit. So if we were talking about Eastern Orthodoxy or other sort of traditions, there might be a more intense sort of fasting that might look similar to Ramadan. But for a lot of folks who are Protestant, like myself, it's going to look much more like you choose something that you're fasting from that's important to you, and that you're going to give it up. Is a very common way to pursue Lent, and also it's common to take a practice on. That would be somewhat more of a more intensive spiritual practice to try to, again, get that discernment. But it's a little more spiritualized, and you get some choice on what you'd like to do.
Is there a communal aspect as well? Because like for us, we get together and break fast. And is there a communal aspect as part of it?
There in some places there are. I mean, in the sense that so if in Roman Catholicism, for instance, you're not eating meat on Friday during Lent, so you would get together for a fish fry, which doesn't count as meat. Again, all the rules. So that is something that would be common. Oftentimes in churches, there is some sort of additional programming where we're working on ourselves or learning about something, and there would be a meal of something like soup or something like that where you're coming together. So that would be common. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, that will conclude our formal program. So basically, just to let everyone know, we will have our evening prayer. I think they're going to have the call for prayer at 7:27. So our congregation can actually start making their way upstairs and getting ready for that prayer. We will have dinner here for our guests. They're going to bring it out in a few minutes. They're going to set it all up. If any of our guests would like to see kind of the prayer or would like to participate, that's okay. There's a little bit of space up there, but we will have the dinner, and just because there's a large crowd here, but upstairs there's probably just as many people, so we're going to have a lot of people here today as well. So we want to at least serve the food and get it ready for our guests. That way when you're taking, everybody else will start coming back down, and then they'll get the second round as well. So that's going to be the plan. So those who need to start praying, you can go upstairs now. Those of our guests, you can kind of just stick around, and we'll just get everything set up in a couple minutes, and then we will have the dinner available.